I'd like to talk to you about rationality and some of its severe limitations and undesirable consequences. Spoiler alert, it has to do with violence, tyranny, and slavery. Okay, so here we go. First limiting factor. You always have to know what influences. So you have something, some situation that you're looking at, and you have to know what can influence it. If, say, the weather is interesting in this case, if you need to know some other information, and so you have to know the influencing factors. And usually you don't. Usually you don't know how many things are influencing it and in what ways. So this is a grave limitation. We assume that, oh, I already know these 4 things can influence the outcome. And based on that, I then go through my rational process. But most of the time, there will be many other things that can influence the process. But I will not know about it. And so it may lead to false consequences and not be really useful in terms of information. So that's the first limiting part, that you don't know the number of influencing factors. Also, you don't know the initial conditions for these influencing factors. So say I wanted to make coconut curry, and I have to have it ready within an hour, and it has to be coconut curry. And then all of a sudden I realize I don't have any coconuts. So what do I do? Well, given the initial condition of the coconuts, or lack of coconuts, I can say, okay, so given that, the best scenario is if I call my friend and then I ask them to drive over to a store, and then they can, and I create a whole scenario where in the end I get the coconuts maybe 20 minutes before everything has to be done, and somehow I manage to make it. But then maybe I didn't realize that actually in the pantry I have some coconut milk. Oh, well then the best scenario now is not calling my friend trying to organize some kind of a coconut shopping spree. Instead, it's just take the coconut milk that you have in the pantry. It's so much easier, right? So if you don't know the influencing factors, or if you don't know the initial conditions of the influencing factors, you will not be likely to arrive at the possible solutions, or the best possible solutions for your problems, whatever it is you're solving. Limitation number 2. Very often, it may appear that we think in a logical way, but actually we're not. This is very common for human beings. So this is the second limitation. The logical process isn't actually logical. It's not really rational. So, first, the initial conditions and the initial influencing factors are usually off, and then the second part, which is the logical process, is also usually off. The consequences of rationality in the human mind can lead to great suffering. And the reason is that we tend to believe our thoughts, you know? Have you ever thought about that? If you think about something, you tend to automatically believe in it. And then, inside of our mind, we create a hierarchy, like a little mini pyramid. And on top, we place the master, the leader. And that leader has the label of rationality. So if we have thoughts that we have labeled rational, then they have all the power over the other types of thoughts and over our actions. So the rational thoughts, even though, because we looked at the limitations, they might actually not be rational, might not actually lead to the best solutions, and so on, they become the leaders. And what happens? Doesn't this sound a little bit like slavery to you? Think about it. If you have a master and you have a slave, what does the master do? The master tells the slave what to do, and the slave executes it. In your mind, your rational thoughts, the ones that have been labeled rational, tell you what you should do. You should make that phone call. You should call that person. This is the right thing to do. You have thought through many scenarios, and this is the right and rational thing to do. But then maybe inside of you, your gut feeling tells you, no, I don't want to. This isn't what I should be doing. I don't know why, but I just don't feel that this is what I should be doing, and I don't want to. But then your rationality tells you you should. What happens? Two scenarios. You either do it, and then you're making the phone call and you're feeling bad about it because you're doing something that you don't want to be doing. So you're creating internal violence where you're forcing yourself to do something that you don't want to. A little bit like the master telling the slave, now you have to go and do this kind of work, even though you don't want to, you don't feel like it, and you're not interested in it. It has nothing to do with you, but I want it done, so you go and do it. And what happens if the slave says no? Or if you say, no, I'm not going to make that phone call? Usually the master will then punish the slave, make the slave feel bad. What happens in your mind? Kind of the same thing. All of a sudden your mind says, okay, so now we're going to make you suffer. And guilt comes up. Oh, I know I should call that person, but I should have done it. And you create internal suffering. So whether you do it or don't do it, there is violence and suffering. And you put yourself in a situation of a slave. This happens when you give your rational thought the label rational, the label master, and you believe in it. See, the sad thing is that usually this master that you have inside of you is only following orders. And the orders that the master is following come from society. So it's not even your rational thought or your warped rational thought. Actually, most of the time, it comes from higher up. And so you're putting yourself in a situation of the slave. And when you're living the life of a slave, it becomes difficult to get in touch with your passion, feel spontaneous joy, and fulfill your highest potential. So here's something interesting. It may be difficult for some people to hear criticisms about rationality. And the reason may be that people see the alternative as, for instance, emotional manipulation. So you can either emotionally manipulate someone into doing something, which kind of isn't a good thing, right? So you kind of don't see that as something ethical. Or you could rationally explain to the person why this is the better alternative. That just feels so much better, right? And so when someone comes with a critique of rationality, then all of a sudden the irrational part of us, the emotional part of us, starts manipulating ourselves and prevents us from hearing about the problems of rationality. And so this is very interesting because it actually points to both of the limitations that we talked about when it comes to rationality. So you think that you want to lead a rational life, you want to be rational, and so you don't listen to the critique of rationality so that you can continue being rational. Wait, there's a problem there, right? So you're actually being emotionally manipulated by your fears to not listen to the critique. So that's the second limitation. And the first limitation is that you may think that the only alternative to rationality is emotional manipulation. And that's the first problem of when it comes to the limitations of rationality, that you don't know how many influencing factors there are, you don't know what the initial conditions of them are, right? So you may think that, well, this is the only alternative, and so you close off from hearing it. So the key message that I wanted to share with you is that rationality has some limitations and has some severe consequences. And so whenever we want to use it as a tool, because it is a tool and we do have access to it, and so it doesn't mean that we should never use it. We should. But we should know its limitations, and knowing its limitations, we can actually free ourselves from its slave-like environment that is imposed upon us as soon as we call it our master.